Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this series of learning Flask with applications, today I will be talking about user registration using Flask. In today's video, I will be diving deep into how you can use Flask and how you can connect to databases to registered users, and we will be looking at little bit HTML code as well, which is not a very long code, so you will not feel uncomfortable in case you are not habituated with HTML code, but it will be pretty easy and I will be discussing everything in this video. So let's start with a revision. In previous video, I talked about the first Flask application that you might make if this is your first time using Flask to build applications. And in that video, we talked about everything that is there to build a normal Flask application. And we did something like this where we first imported the Flask library and then we created an instance from the Flask library which will work as the application interface or server, and then we created a route which will trigger a function when that URL is called from the browser, and it will return a message. In this case it will be an header that is hello. So let's go back to our code, and this is our starting template, you can say, and here I am outputting a header called hello to this Flask tutorial. So let's open our PowerShell by clicking Control and Tilt. Then this PowerShell will open, or terminal, and to run the application, to Flask application, we first need to go to environment, then scripts, and then activate. And in this way the environment, the virtual environment, will be activated, and whatever libraries are installed in that environment, that will be accessed by this whole application. To run the application, we need to write something like this, and because the file name is run.py, I'm using run.py and I'm running it using Python. So when I press enter, it will be opening at a particular URL, and if you control and click on it, it will open that on a browser. So this is the browser, and this is the output. Okay, so till this point we have already talked about a lot how this whole thing is working. Now in this video, as I said, I'll be talking about user registration. So let's talk about and start learning about that. First of all, you need to know what are templates. In Flask we use templates, and templates are nothing but, template is nothing but a folder. There will be a folder called templates. Inside that folder you will have lots of HTML code. So for example, in this video, because we are creating user registration, we will mostly be focusing on register.html, because that will be the HTML code where users will be registering and inputting their user inputs. For login video, for other things, we will be writing other HTML codes that we will talk in different video. So in Flask application, usually we return messages, and most of the cases we return HTML messages. So when we return HTML content, there is also a possibility that we can return a whole HTML page from a Flask application. And because writing the whole application or writing the whole HTML code inside Python could be a tedious task, that's why Python gives us a render template function that is used to just, you can pass the name of your HTML code that is present inside the templates folder, and Flask will automatically find out that folder and it will render that HTML and return it to the user. That's how we are going to write the HTML code for registration. So this is the registration code. In this registration code, what we are doing, we are doing nothing much. We are just creating a form. In this form, we are having some username, email, and password. For each of these inputs, we are having an input field, and each input field has a particular name. Please make sure that the names are right, because at the end of the video, I'll be also talking about one of the warnings or one of the things that most of the people do wrong, which gives them error. So make sure that the names are correct. And some other important things are these two. Okay, first of all, in this form you have to write down the action and the method. Action, whatever you are in the action, you need to give an URL. Okay, there are many ways. If you are using PHP or some other programming language, there are other ways to do that, but for now, if you are using Flask, you need to give an URL, which in this case is /register. This is the URL that I will be using, which will trigger a function that will take care of the registration. That's why I'm using this name. Now in this case, you can use any other URL, that is perfectly your choice. But most of the time, because it makes sense, because we are taking care of registration, so obviously I will use the name register, or you can also use sign up, whatever is your preference. The next thing is method. It is very important that you mention the method, because otherwise HTML will not know how it should request the backend. By specifying the method, it will know what kind of request it is sending. By default, it is a get request, which is not the case right now. Right now we want a post request, so we need to specifically mention that it is a post request, so the method should be post. The second thing is the type of button. Now it could be button or anything, but it should have a type of submit, because submit is the only type that triggers the form to send the whole data that is inputted by the user, and it will send it back to the action, I mean the URL that is mentioned in the action attribute. So these two things are something that you need to keep in mind, and make sure that you include them in your HTML code. The next thing is about the Flask application. So let's talk about the Flask application a little bit in more detail. Now that we have our basic Flask application, what I will do, I will create a templates folder. As I mentioned, all the HTML code that we are going to write, that will be inside the HTML folder, sorry, the templates folder. So let's make that folder right now. This is the templates folder. Inside this folder, what you need to do, you need to keep on adding some HTML code, whatever code you need. Right now we need to create a registration HTML code. Okay, so I'll be copy pasting some code that I have already written in registration, so that this video will not be too long. So this is the HTML code that I will be using for this small project. And as you can see, again I am telling you, the names are very important. Okay, so make sure that you know what kind of names you are using for each kind of input field. The labels are not that much important, they are only important because to show user what kind of input they should give for that particular input. But the most important ones are the input fields. Okay, so make sure that the names are different, and also you should remember the what kind of names are used, because these same names will be used in the Flask application as well. The next thing that we are going to focus is what we should do using render template. This is very simple. You just need to import render template function from Flask, which is already available there, and you just need to pass the register.html, which we just created, and this will be inside quotes, and you don't have to worry about whether you need to provide the path of the templates folder or not, because Flask is automatically going to find out the HTML code inside the templates folder because of the function render template. As you can see, the function name already suggests that it is doing something with the templates folder. So in the base URL // you will now see the registration.html result. So let me write down the render template code, and first we have to import the render template function, and then we have to pass the registration.html in quotes. Okay, so now we are done, and if you look at the result, then you will see that if I refresh my web browser, then you will see the registration page. It is quite a very simple interface, and it's not doing much because we are not going to focus on CSS, but instead you will see that right now if you click on the register button, you will get a not found page error. So if I do right now, it will see that it is not found. Why? Because this URL is not yet used. I have not used this URL to trigger any kind of function, and because of that it will say that it is not found. So we need to create a function that will be triggered when that kind of URL is accessed. Now I have written the code that will be triggered when the register URL is accessed. So this is the code that I am using, and register is a function that will be triggered when register URL is called. In the register function, you could see a lot of different things, although it follows the same strategy we used in previous videos, where we tracked or we triggered a function according to the URL that was accessed by the user. But in this function, you could see some extra things, for example, methods and request. But make sure that before writing this code, you import request, because this object is required. Now let's talk about what this code will be doing. So in the code, you could see methods and the request.method. The register can handle both get and both post requests. These are the two kinds of requests that we will be getting from the user. So this method is made in such a way that it can get both kinds of, it can handle both kinds of requests whenever // registered URL is accessed. And there is another thing, that is the request object. Through this request object, what is this request object, by the way? Whenever a request comes to our server for any kind of after accessing any kind of URL, for example, right now it is /register, that request object will be created, and inside the request object, many kinds of properties and functions will be available to us that is accessible by Flask. Okay, so Flask gives us that access. So this request object contains a method property. This method property tells us what kind of request is sent to the server. It could be get request, post request, delete request, put request. There are many kinds of requests, but right now we are most concerned about get and post. And if you remember, in the HTML code, we made sure that the method when or the request, that when we pass the or when we send the form to the server, what kind of request it will be following. It will be following the post kind of request. So that's what the request should be, and along with it, it should also handle get request. Why? Because whenever we go back to the register page or access the register page, the get request will be used. That's why we should always make sure that get request is also something that is handled by this register function. And what we need to do when a get request is sent, we simply need to return the register.html file. Now that we discussed about the request and the methods property or function argument inside this route decorator, we need to talk about how we can design the DB model. This part is very important because this is where the actual registration starts, because registration simply means in the database the user should exist, and because of that we need to make sure there is a database, and we are using that database to store that user, whoever is using the registration process inside our server. To do that, we need to make a DB model. Right now I am using SQLAlchemy to create the DB model, database model. And first of all, we need to initialize the SQLAlchemy and create an instance from that SQLAlchemy class. This instance will be used to create models. Right now, although I am using this only to make one model, which is user, you can use to make any number of models. To make a model, how the model making will look like, it is just a class which will inherit db.mod. By doing that, you'll be doing everything. Inside it, you just have to pass down what kind of columns you want to use inside this model. Right now, this user model is using the table name users. Okay, by the way, here is the distinction. Although the model name is user, the table name could be different. Okay, it is just the user is used to represent the database users. User is an object of the database users. That's what you can understand. And inside the database, how the database is defined, the database is defined with 4 columns. The first one is id, which is a type integer, and it is the primary key. Then the username, which is a string. In SQL term, you can call it as varchar, which is 20 length, and it is not null. In Python, you can do that using the argument nullable. You can set it to false, which means it should not be null. The next column is email, which is again a string of 20 length. It is not null, it should not be null, and it should be unique. We all know email should be unique. The last one is the password. I made the password a little bit longer, which is 200. You will see why I made it such that. And the another thing is I am also making it not null. So this is the DB model that I am using, which is users. The next thing is the Flask application code. Before diving into the Flask application code, let me write down this DB model code. When you are using the DB model code, please make sure that you define the DB model or you write the DB model code inside a different folder. It will make the whole code a much cleaner, and it will be easy to handle further updates, or in kind of cases if you are using it for larger applications, it is the best practice if you are defining your models in a different file. So I will be creating another file called model.py, and the model.py, inside this function, inside this file, I'll be writing all the database code. So again, I'll be explaining. I am using SQLAlchemy, Flask SQLAlchemy. So make sure that you install this application, you install this library. I'll be giving you all the library names that I'm using in this folder, so that you can install it later in your virtual library and you do not get any kind of error in case you are doing the same along with me. But inside this code, I will again explain. I am making a db variable, which is an instance from SQLAlchemy class. This instance has a model which can be used to create models. Right now we are creating a model of user. The user is connected to the table name users, and this table has 4 total columns: ID, username, email, and password. And these are the same columns, or these are the same thing that, if you remember, in our form we also use the same kind of values. Apart from ID, we used username, email, and password. If you are not familiar with databases, it is not a problem. You can just follow along and later you can research about it, or in case if you are finding it too much difficult, you can let me know in the comments as well. I will try to explain it in much simpler way in later videos. Now let's go back to our run.py file and let's look at the code that we need to register the user. So to do the registration, what we need to do in the Flask model, first we need to import the DB and user. User is the model and DB is the database. That was the instance of SQLAlchemy, if you remember, from the model.py file. So we can do that using this line. Then we need to configure something inside the application. See, the whole application, it needs some configuration, and it has already some configured file or variables inside it. So whenever the application is starting, it has some variables inside it, and it is stored in the config file or config object, you can say. If you want, you can set different values inside this config object, but it should be something that is allowed in the application. For example, one of the property names, or you can say one of the object properties, are SQLAlchemy database URI, which simply tells the application where to look for the database that is used in the SQLAlchemy. Right now I'm using MySQL database. That's why you can see the URI looks like this: MySQL, then colon, and then for 2 forward slashes, and then how you need to write your database name or the URI. It is like this. First you need to start with username. Most of the time your MySQL database username is root, so you can use root, or if it is something else that you know, then you can use that name. Then you need to again give a colon, and then you need to use the password that you have in your MySQL. Then you need to give @ and hostname. Most of the time it is localhost, so you can give localhost, and then you give a forward slash and then the DB name. We'll look into it in little further in the code. I will explain it again. And then after you configure this, you need to initialize the app using the database. Then within the app context, okay, this is very important to do with app.app context. This line is very important. Other than that, you will get an error. So please make sure that you wrap the db.createAll inside the with app.app context. After you did it, you will be able to, now your application is configured with the database, and your database tables and database is created using the db.createAll function. So this is all about this code. Now finally, when you go to the registration code, it will be much simpler, and it is not going to be a very difficult code. What we are doing, we are creating a user using the user model that we implemented in the model.py file. inside user we are passing all the values that are used in the user model. For example, username, email, and password. What kind of values we are passing? We are passing the request.form values. Remember, whenever you know that your user is passing the values by filling a form, then all the values that you will be getting, they will be inside the request.form object. All right. And inside the request.form, what kind of names you need to use? These are the same names that we are using inside the registration.html. If you remember, inside the input tables, sorry, inside the input tags, you have created a name attribute and you have given some names. Those same names will be used in the request.form object to access the values that are given by the user. That's why it is very important to remember what kind of names you have given. Otherwise, if you misspell it, it will give you an error. After you have created the user, you need to add this user to your database. You can do that using db.session.add user, and then finally you can commit this, or you can modify your actual database and update it. Okay, before these steps, whatever you did, these did not make any kind of permanent change in the database. You can see that they are on the fly, and actually was different, and this is just a copy. Okay, so whenever you do db.session.commit, it makes the changes on the database, on the original database, so the changes were reflected in the database. But you have to make sure that you should do inside a try and except block, because db.session.commit is the step where it will check whether there is any integrity error happening because of the primary key, or any kind of too much any column that you have defined. For example, we have defined many columns as varchars of 10 length, right? If user gives a value which is more than that, the database will give you an error. So you have to handle that. To handle that, I have used a try except block. If we get any kind of exception from that line of db.session.commit, we will go to the except block and will return something went wrong with a return key or with a status code of 404, which stands for not found. Okay, so this is about all about the registration code. And again, I am mentioning it here, you should be cautious about this thing, that you are using the same name inside your registration.html file, the name that you are using in your Flask file. Okay, otherwise it will definitely going to give you error. And again, I face the same error, that's why I'm mentioning it again and again. Now let's go back to the code, and I'll show you the demo how it works, and I will also show you how it looks or reflects in the database. This is the whole code of the file run.py. I have already copy pasted all the things that we need to complete the whole Flask application. Uh, right now, one more thing I need to discuss with you was the workzoob.security. I have not mentioned this, and I also told you that in the model file why I used 200 in case of other, where in case of other things I only used 20. Why I used 200? The simple reason is we are using this generate password has to generate hash code or hash value for this password. It is usually trained, that is used to, so that passwords are not easily hacked. That's the same thing I'm doing here. And because I am generating a hash value, it is a very long value, it is going to be a long value, and in case you are not preparing your whole model for that, it will give you an error. Okay, too much length or maximum length exceeded, these kind of errors you will be getting. So that's why make sure that you keep the value a little longer. And after that, I will be finally demonstrating you how this whole thing will be working. And I'll be also opening the MySQL workbench, where you will be able to see whether everything is being reflected on the database. The database I am using is called Flask Learning. It is already created in my MySQL workbench, and the whole thing that I just mentioned you, like username, then password, then @localhost, this is how I have used. Okay, my username is root, and then this is my password, and then @localhost. Usually it is localhost, but your password will be changed, so make sure that you give your own password. Now finally we will be diving into the demonstration. So let's start the demonstration. I have already, as you from the start, I'm already running the whole Plus application, so you do not need to run it again. So whenever you make any changes, make sure that in the browser you make reload it, okay, so that it runs the new code, because it does not automatically update these things. So now that everything is updated, and you know that the current code is running in your Flask application, what you need to do, you need to give username, email and password, okay. Just make sure that the database is new and no users are inserted. The reason I'm saying this is because in case you are using the same username or same email, it will give you an error, okay. So right now I am going to give a username Arup, then just any sample Gmail, then 1234, okay. I will register and see what happens, okay. So it says something went wrong because it is giving an error. So let's look at what the error is, and most probably the error is regarding the length. So we will be fixing that. To look at the error, what is happening, you just need to open the terminal, and in the code, what how you should make the modification. Because I'm catching the exception, in case you want to know what kind of error is happening, you should remove this try except block, so that you'll be able to see what kind of error you are getting right now. Because we are not catching the exception, it will automatically give the exception in the terminal. So I will again go back to my browser and use the same kind of values, already it is there. So I will just give the password and register, and as you can see that the values and the error is integrity error. And the reason is, the reason for this is, you can see at the bottom, duplicate entry of orupjana@gmail.com. Just as I mentioned, this is the same error I just mentioned. The integrity error comes when some kind of rule that you made in your database is not valid, or you can say is not followed, okay. Right now what is happening, this email address is already present in the database, and because I use the same address when I inputted in the form, that's why it is giving me this kind of error. So make sure that you are not using the same kind of Gmail, otherwise you will get the similar kind of problems. And one more task you can take it as an exercise is that you should input such kind of output, like instead of saying something went wrong, which was little bit not so obvious that I used the same Gmail address or email address, you can make the outcome or output more obvious to the user, so that they can provide different email. You can do that as an exercise. So right now I will just uh, undo everything and remove the comments, and instead of using the Gmail that I just used, I will use some other Gmail. So let's go back and use this Gmail, okay. Now this Gmail is not registered in the database, so let's register with the following with the given values. And when you register, you see that there is an error which is saying that template not found register .html, because I have used the register name where the file name was registration. So let me change the file name. And again it is saying that something went wrong, and let me check what went wrong again. Okay, let's use another input. Actually, when I looked into the issue, that I saw that in the database it is already given the values, okay. So this value was already stored, but still it gave some error that says something went wrong. So let's try with another new value which is not yet given, and let's use that, and let's register. So you can see that it is not showing any result, because I have not given any kind of feature where it will show result, but it came again to the register page. So how you will know how whether it changed in your database or not, you will just, I will open my MySQL workbench, and inside this MySQL workbench, if you first you have to use the Flask learning, because that's the database I'm using. So when you run it, you will be using the Flask learning, and finally you run this
SQL code, and you will see the users that were registered within your database. So this is how you create your registration page. If you like this video, you can like it, and you can comment if you have any kind of questions or queries. Please subscribe in case if you feel that these kind of videos are helpful to you, because it will support me a lot. Thank you so much.